blood on the concrete, a shattered Rolex, and the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld gasping for breath. 6 armed hitters had Dominic Santoro dead to rights. But they didn't account for the 320-pound diner waitress stepping out of the shadows holding a tire iron and a deeply violent past. Harriet Lawson was fat. There was no polite way to skirt around it, and Harriet herself had long ago stopped trying to hide it under oversized cardigans or flattering vertical stripes. At 5'8" and 320 pounds, she was a mountain of a woman carrying her grief in thick layers around her midsection hips and heavily dimpled arms. To the late-night patrons of Richie's 24-hour diner, on the grimier edge of Chicago's South Side, she was just Hattie, the slow-moving, heavily sweating fixture who kept their coffee cups full and absorbed their rude remarks with a blank, tired stare. Her uniform, a pale yellow polyester dress that clung uncomfortably to her rolls, was permanently stained with fryer grease and dried ketchup. Every step she took behind the counter was accompanied by the heavy squeak of orthopedic shoes and the quiet, agonizing protest of her swollen knees. People didn't look at Harriet. They looked right through her. In a society that worships sharp edges and thin silhouettes, a heavily obese, middle-aged waitress was practically invisible. And for the last 6 years, invisibility was exactly what Harriet had been praying for. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The diner was mostly dead, save for a couple of exhausted long-haul truckers and a handful of drunk college kids sobering up over platefuls of chili cheese fries. Then the bell above the door chimed, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Dominic Santoro walked in. Dominic was a man whose reputation preceded him in whispers that usually ended in blood. He was the head of the Santoro crime family, a ruthless, calculating syndicate boss who had taken over the Chicago docks and the underground gambling rings with a terrifying combination of charm and brutal violence. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that probably cost more than Harriet made in 2 years. His dark eyes were cold, sweeping the diner with the paranoia of a man who knew he had a target on his back every second of the day. Despite his status, Dominic was a regular at Richie's. He came in twice a week, always alone, always sitting in the corner booth facing the door. He never caused trouble, and he always left a $100 bill tucked under his empty coffee cup. Harriet waddled over to his booth, a fresh pot of black coffee in her thick hand. She poured the dark liquid into his mug, her heavy breathing audible in the quiet space. "Rough night, Mr. Santoro?" She asked, her voice a raspy, nicotine-stained baritone, even though she hadn't smoked in a decade. Dominic didn't look up from his phone, but the rigid set of his jaw softened a fraction. "You have no idea, Hattie. Just the cherry pie tonight. And make it quick. I have a feeling I've overstayed my welcome in this neighborhood." Harriet nodded slowly, her multiple chins wobbling, as she turned to head back to the kitchen. But as she sliced the pie, her eyes caught movement outside the grease-streaked diner window. A black Lincoln Navigator had rolled to a silent stop across the street, killing its headlights. The diner was situated right next to a multi-level concrete parking garage, a brutalist eyesore where Dominic usually parked his armored Mercedes. Through the foggy glass, Harriet watched as the doors of the Lincoln opened. 6 men stepped out. They weren't local street thugs. Harriet knew the difference. Even from a distance, she could read their body language. They moved with a predatory synchronized efficiency. They wore dark tactical jackets, and the way they held their arms slightly away from their bodies told Harriet everything she needed to know about the concealed heat they were packing. One of them stepped under a street lamp. It was Declan O'Bannon, the notorious enforcer for the Irish syndicate that had been fighting a bloody turf war with the Santoro family for the past 8 months. Declan was a sadist who favored straight razors and piano wire. If Declan was here with 5 of his best hitters, this wasn't an intimidation tactic. This was an assassination. Harriet placed the cherry pie in front of Dominic. He took one bite, checked his phone again, and cursed under his breath. He tossed a crumpled $100 bill onto the table, stood up abruptly, and buttoned his suit jacket. "Keep the change, Hattie." Dominic muttered, heading for the side door that led directly into the alley adjoining the parking garage. Harriet stood perfectly still. The heavy aches in her feet faded into the background. The slow, sluggish rhythm of her depressed life suddenly spiked. Before her husband Carter had been blown to pieces by an IED in Bogota during a botched extraction mission, Harriet wasn't Hattie the Fat Waitress. She was Chief Warrant Officer Harriet Lawson, one of the most lethal close-quarters combat instructors contracted by Aegis Defense Services. She had spent 15 years training elite operators in Krav Maga Kali, knife fighting, and improvised weapon combat. When Carter died, a piece of her soul shattered. She stopped working out, started eating to numb the agonizing void, and buried herself under 300 pounds of protective fat, hiding in a city where no one knew her name. But as she watched the 6 men slip quietly into the dark maw of the parking garage, right behind Dominic Santoro, an old dormant spark ignited in her chest. Muscle memory buried under years of grease and apathy began to twitch. She didn't owe Dominic Santoro her life. He was a criminal, a murderer, but he had always treated her like a human being. He never mocked her weight. He never sneered at her. In a world that treated Harriet like garbage, Dominic had offered her basic dignity. Harriet walked calmly behind the counter, reaching into the utility closet. Her thick, calloused fingers wrapped around the handle of a solid steel 24-inch breaker bar that the owner used to pry open the rusted dumpster lids. It weighed about 8 pounds. In Harriet's massive grip, it felt light as a feather. She pushed her way out the back door, her heavy orthopedic shoes hitting the damp pavement of the alley. She was going into the garage. Level C of the municipal parking garage smelled intensely of stale urine, wet dust, and old exhaust. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, strobing shadows across the endless rows of concrete pillars. Dominic Santoro realized his mistake the moment he heard the heavy steel door of the stairwell click shut behind him. He reached into his tailored jacket, his hand resting on the grip of his custom 9mm Beretta, and quickened his pace toward his armored Mercedes G-Wagon, parked in VIP spot 42. "Going somewhere, Dominic." The voice echoed off the concrete, dripping with a thick, mocking brogue. Declan O'Bannon stepped out from behind a concrete pillar blocking the path to the Mercedes. In his hand, a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP glinted in the dim light. Dominic spun around, only to find 3 more men fanning out from the rear, effectively boxing him in. 2 more stepped out from between a row of parked cars to his left. 6-1. He was perfectly, cleanly trapped. "Declan." Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm despite the adrenaline spiking through his veins. "I didn't think the Irish had the balls to cross into my territory without an army." "We are the army, you greasy bastard," Declan sneered, taking a step forward. "Your boys at the docks have been a thorn in my boss's side for too long. Tonight we cut off the head of the snake, and we're going to make it hurt." Dominic didn't wait for the monologue to end. With a speed that belied his relaxed posture, he drew his Beretta and fired twice. The suppressed shots, puffed, tore through the quiet garage. One of Declan's men took a round to the throat, collapsing in a gurgling heap of blood. But 6-1 were impossible odds, even for a seasoned killer. Before Dominic could reacquire a target, a massive hitter named Finn tackled him from the blind side. The Beretta clattered across the concrete. Dominic fought fiercely, landing a brutal elbow to Finn's jaw, but two more men piled on. A sharp, breathless grunt escaped Dominic's lips as a 6-inch combat knife slid neatly between his ribs on the left side. The pain was blinding. His knees buckled, and he was roughly shoved back against the cold concrete pillar, bleeding profusely. Declan walked up slowly, kicking Dominic's fallen gun under a nearby sedan. He smiled, pulling a straight razor from his coat. "Hold him up, boys. I want him to look at me while I take his eyes." The men pinned Dominic's arms against the pillar. Dominic coughed a thin trail of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. He braced himself for the end. Then a sound broke the tension. Clack, squeak, clack, squeak. The heavy rhythmic sound of rubber-soled orthopedic shoes echoing in the cavernous garage. Declan paused, turning his head. The remaining 5 hitters looked toward the shadows near the entrance ramp. Out of the gloom walked Harriet. She was panting slightly, sweat already beading on her forehead and running down her multiple chins. Her yellow uniform was straining against her immense bulk. In her right hand, resting casually against her thick thigh, was the heavy steel breaker bar. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Declan erupted into laughter. "Well, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, look at this," Declan barked, lowering his razor. The local whale wandered out of the ocean. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Did someone leave a donut out here?" His men chuckled, keeping their grip on the bleeding Mafia boss. Dominic forced his eyes open, shock piercing through his hazy, pain-filled mind. "Hattie," he wheezed. "Run! Get out of here!" Harriet didn't run. She didn't even flinch at the insult. She simply reached up with her left hand, calmly wiped the sweat from her brow, and tightened her grip on the steel bar. "You boys," Harriet said, her raspy voice deadpan and shockingly steady. "You forgot to pay for your coffee." "Shoot the fat bitch," Declan ordered, dismissively turning his attention back to Dominic. The closest hitter, a lanky man with a scarred cheek, raised his suppressed pistol and aimed it directly at Harriet's broad chest. He didn't even bother to take a proper stance. He thought he was executing livestock. He pulled the trigger. What happened next defied every law of physics the men in that room thought they understood. Harriet didn't dive for cover. She didn't cower, using a technique she had drilled into Special Forces operatives 10,000 times. She dropped her massive weight, slipping under the line of fire as the bullet whizzed inches past her ear. Her 320 pounds of mass instantly transformed from a liability into a terrifying, unstoppable weapon of kinetic energy. She lunged forward, her enormous thighs driving her low and fast. Before the shooter could adjust his aim downwards, Harriet was inside his guard. She swung the steel breaker bar not with her arm, but with the full twisting rotation of her heavy hips. Crack! The steel bar connected with the man's right kneecap. The bone didn't just break, it exploded into powder. The man shrieked, folding forward instinctively. As his head came down, Harriet brought her left elbow up in a vicious, perfectly timed uppercut. The strike, backed by the sheer density of her body weight, shattered his nose and drove the bone fragments upward. He hit the concrete dead before he stopped sliding. Silence slammed back into the garage, heavy and suffocating. Declan's smile vanished. The remaining 4 men stared in paralyzed disbelief at the obese waitress standing over their dead comrade. "What the fuck?" Finn whispered. Harriet didn't wait for them to recover. She moved like a grizzly bear, deceptively fast, brutally efficient, and completely devoid of hesitation. She charged the next man in line. He raised his gun, panicking, and fired wildly. A bullet grazed Harriet's meaty shoulder, tearing through the yellow polyester and slicing a shallow groove in her flesh. She didn't even blink. The pain was nothing compared to the agony she carried every single day. She closed the distance in 2 thunderous steps. She didn't swing the bar this time. Instead, she thrust it forward like a spear, ramming the blunt steel tip directly into the man's solar plexus. All the air violently evacuated his lungs. As he doubled over, gasping like a fish, Harriet grabbed the back of his tactical jacket with her free hand, planted her massive feet, and used her immense low center of gravity to execute a flawless judo throw. She launched the 200-pound hitter through the air. He smashed headfirst into the windshield of the Lincoln Navigator, his neck snapping with a sickening crunch. 2 down in less than 6 seconds. Dominic Santoro, bleeding out against the pillar, watched with wide, disbelieving eyes. The woman who had served him cherry pie for 3 years, the woman who struggled to bend over to pick up a dropped napkin, was dismantling highly trained syndicate killers with the cold, mechanical precision of an elite apex predator. Declan O'Bannon finally snapped out of his shock. "Kill her, empty your mags into the fat cow!" he screamed, dropping his razor and desperately reaching for a backup weapon at his ankle. The 2 men holding Dominic dropped him and spun toward Harriet. They were professionals, and they finally realized they were fighting for their lives. They spread out, trying to catch her in a crossfire. But Harriet was already in motion. She knew her stamina was her weakest link. Carrying this much weight, her heart was pounding against her ribs like a jackhammer, and her lungs were burning. She had about 30 seconds of high-intensity output before her body would completely shut down. She had to end this now. The human body, when burdened by 320 pounds of stagnant mass, is not designed for prolonged combat. Harriet's lungs were screaming, her vision narrowing into a dark, pulsing tunnel. Every beat of her heart felt like a hammer striking the inside of her ribs. She had exactly 20 seconds left before severe hypoxia and lactic acid buildup would drop her to the concrete. The 2 remaining hitter's men, named Boyd and Mitchell, fanned out to her left and right. They had dropped the arrogance. They raised their Glock 19 aiming center mass. "Take her down!" Declan roared finally, freeing a subcompact pistol from his ankle holster. Harriet didn't retreat. Retreating required agility she no longer possessed. Instead, she threw her massive body heavily to the right, diving behind the thick concrete pillar where Dominic lay bleeding. Bullets chipped the stone showering her, and the Mafia boss in razor-sharp concrete dust. Boyd advanced cautiously on the left side of the pillar, his tactical boots crunching on the debris. Mitchell flanked right. They were trying to catch her in a pincer movement. It was textbook urban tactics, but Harriet wrote the textbook they trained from back at Aegis Defense Services. She waited until Boyd's shadow crossed the edge of the pillar. Instead of stepping out to strike, Harriet dropped to one knee, her heavily padded joints screaming in protest. She swung the 8-pound steel breaker bar low inches above the floor, aiming blindly around the corner. The steel connected with Boyd's shin with a sickening wet snap. Boyd screamed, his leg buckling instantly. As he collapsed forward, Harriet reached around the pillar, her thick fingers rapping violently into the tactical webbing of his vest. With a guttural roar, she hauled the 200-pound man around the concrete column, using him as a human shield, just as Mitchell rounded the opposite side and opened fire. 3 suppressed rounds thwipped into Boyd's back. Mitchell froze, his eyes widening as he realized he had just gunned down his own partner. That microsecond of hesitation was all Harriet needed. She didn't bother swinging the heavy bar. She hurled it like a javelin. The 8-pound steel rod tumbled end over end and struck Mitchell squarely in the throat. His windpipe crushed instantly. He dropped his Glock, clutching his neck as he fell back against a parked Toyota Camry, suffocating in grim silence. 5 down. Only Declan remained. Harriet leaned heavily against the pillar, her chest heaving. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, mixing with the blood from the bullet graze on her shoulder. Her yellow polyester uniform was torn and soaked. Her legs trembled violently under her immense weight. Her 30 seconds of explosive energy were gone. She was running on fumes and pure, unadulterated rage. Declan O'Bannon stepped into the aisle. He didn't look like a smug syndicate boss anymore. He looked like a man who had just watched a ghost slaughter his best men. He raised his ankle gun, aiming it at Harriet's broad, heaving chest. "You're dead, you fat bitch!" He spat his finger, tightening on the trigger. Click! The gun jammed. In his panic to draw the weapon, he hadn't fully cleared the dust from the holster, causing a misfeed. Declan cursed, frantically racking the slide. But Harriet was already moving. It wasn't the lightning-fast charge from a minute ago. It was a heavy, lumbering, unstoppable march. She was a runaway freight train made of grief and dense flesh. Declan cleared the jam just as Harriet reached him. He fired point blank. The 9mm round tore into the thick, fleshy part of Harriet's left hip. The impact spun her slightly, a searing flare of agony ripping through her nervous system. But she had 3 inches of dense adipose tissue protecting her vital organs. The bullet lodged deep in the fat, failing to shatter the pelvic bone. She roared a raw, terrifying sound of a woman who had already lost everything that mattered. Before Declan could fire again, Harriet crashed into him. The sheer kinetic force of 320 pounds colliding with a stationary target was devastating. Declan was thrown backward, his spine slamming brutally into the concrete wall of the parking garage. The breath left his lungs in a violent rush. Harriet pinned him there. She pressed her massive, heavy forearm against his throat, using her entire body weight to lock him in place. Declan gagged, his eyes bulging as he desperately clawed at her thick arm, kicking his legs. But he couldn't move her. He was trapped under a mountain. "You came to the wrong diner," Harriet whispered, her raspy voice, a harsh rasp in his ear. She reached down to her side, her hand finding the heavy steel meat thermometer she always kept tucked in the pocket of her apron to check the deep fryer. It was 6 inches of solid, sharpened stainless steel. Declan's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he saw the crude weapon. He tried to scream, but Harriet's forearm crushed his larynx. She didn't hesitate. With a sharp, practiced thrust, she drove the thick steel probe directly into the soft spot under Declan's jaw, angling it upward into the brain stem. Declan's body went rigidly taut, spasming violently for 3 seconds before going completely limp. Harriet let go. Declan slid down the concrete wall, leaving a thick smear of crimson behind him. The garage was silent again, save for the rhythmic dripping of fluids and Harriet's wet, ragged breathing. She stood there for a moment, her massive chest rising and falling, blood soaking the left side of her yellow dress. She looked at her trembling, grease-stained hands. The monster inside her, asleep for 6 years, was awake. And it was starving. Harriet turned, slowly dragging her injured left leg, and walked back to the concrete pillar. Dominic Santoro was slumped against the stone, his face the color of old ash. He was pressing his hands against the stab wound in his ribs, blood leaking between his expensive manicured fingers. He looked up at the morbidly obese waitress, his eyes glazed with shock and blood loss. He looked at the bodies of 6 elite cartel hitters, scattered around the garage like broken toys. "Hattie." Dominic coughed, a bubble of blood forming on his lips. What are you?" Harriet didn't answer right away. She knelt painfully beside him, pulling a clean, folded bar towel from her apron pocket. She pushed his hands away and pressed the thick cloth hard against his stab wound. Dominic hissed in pain, his head snapping back. "Keep the pressure on, Mr. Santoro." Harriet ordered, her voice devoid of its usual tired subservience. "The blade missed your lung, but you've got a nicked intercostal artery. You have about 10 minutes before your blood pressure drops too low to recover." Dominic stared at her, his mind struggling to process the clinical military precision of her words. You just wiped out the O'Bannon crew, with a pry bar and a meat thermometer." "I used what was available," Harriet said flatly. She reached into Dominic's jacket, ignoring his flinch, and pulled out his encrypted smartphone. "I'm calling Dr. Aris at Northwestern Memorial. He's your private trauma guy, right? The one on your payroll." Dominic's eyes widened. How do you know about Dr. Aris?" Harriet dialed the number, putting the phone on speaker and resting it on Dominic's chest. "Because I didn't end up at Richie's diner by accident, Dominic. And I didn't save your life tonight just because you tip $100 for cherry pie." Dominic gritted his teeth, the pain sharpening his focus. "Who sent you? Are you fed C. Idaho AI?" "My name is Chief Warrant Officer Harriet Lawson," she said, her voice turning cold as ice. "My husband was Carter Lawson. 6 years ago, his extraction team in Bogota was wiped out by a remote-detonated IED. The government called it a random cartel strike. But it wasn't. The explosives used were military-grade C4, traceable to a shipment stolen from the Chicago rail yards 3 months prior. Dominic swallowed hard realization, dawning in his dark eyes. The Russian syndicate, the Volkov brothers, they control the rail yards. "Exactly," Harriet said softly. "But I couldn't touch the Volkovs. I was just a grieving widow, a retired contractor, rapidly eating herself to death. I needed an army. I needed someone with the resources, the men, and the absolute lack of moral compass to wage a war against the Russians." The phone clicked, and a sleepy voice answered on the other end. "Yeah." Harriet hit the mute button. She leaned in close to Dominic, her heavy face mere inches from his. "You've been bleeding territory to the O'Bannon crew for a year. I knew Declan was tracking you. I knew he'd make a play eventually. I just had to wait, serve you coffee and be in the right place at the right time." She gestured to the carnage around them. "I just saved the Santoro family. You owe me your life, Dominic. And in your world, a life debt is blood-bound." Dominic looked at the fat, bleeding, terrifying woman kneeling beside him. He saw the cold, calculated fire in her eyes, the eyes of a predator who had disguised herself as prey for 6 long years. A slow, bloody smile spread across his face. "You want the Volkovs," Dominic whispered. "I want them burned to the ground," Harriet corrected. "I want their supply lines, severed, their capos gutted, and I want Yuri Volkov brought to me alive. And you are going to use the entire Santoro syndicate to do it." Dominic chuckled, the sound quickly turning into a wet cough. "You're a demon, Hattie." "I'm a widow," she replied. She unmuted the phone. "Doctor, Oris Dominic Santoro has a puncture wound to the left thoracic cavity. Severe hemorrhaging. Bring the private trauma van to the municipal garage on Halstead Street, Level C. You have exactly 8 minutes." She hung up the phone and tucked it back into Dominic's pocket. With a heavy groan, Harriet pushed herself to her feet. Her hip throbbed violently, her polyester dress clinging to her sweating, bleeding skin. "Where are you going?" Dominic wheezed. Harriet turned, looking back toward the alley door that led to Richie's 24-hour diner. "I left the deep fryer on," Harriet said, her voice dropping back into its familiar raspy monotone. "And the truckers at table 4 are waiting on their chili fries. Send a cleanup crew for these bodies. I'll see you on Thursday, Mr. Santoro. Usual booth. We have a war to plan." She turned and limped back toward the diner, a massive, heavily breathing silhouette disappearing into the Chicago night, leaving the king of the underworld, bleeding, smiling, and absolutely terrified in her wake. If this story of Harriet's hidden past and her brutal, unexpected defense of a Mafia boss kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. What do you think Harriet and Dominic will do to the Russian syndicate next? Drop your wildest theories in the comments below. Don't forget to share this gripping, real-life, inspired Mafia drama with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for the explosive next chapter of Harriet's Revenge. Hit the bell icon now